Underdevelopment isn't a stage of development, but its consequence. Welcome to a book that is so important to so many people that it is passed into a status of legend, almost mythological status.
You know, Julia, the problem with the natural resources is that they go away and they are not too gentle, so they don't even say goodbye, and you'll never recover them.
When the former Venezuelan president Hugo Chávez met Barack Obama, he presented the American president with a copy of this book. When Isabel Allende fled Chile after a 1973 coup, she took a handful of things, and one of those things was a copy of this book. When El Salvador's authorities searched the body of a guerrilla fighter who had been fighting against the death squads in the country, they found a bloody copy of this book. I am talking, of course, about Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. Reading this book will give you a rich understanding of Latin American history as well as a deeper knowledge of the ways that colonization works. And I hope it gives you as well a little bit of that kind of burning fury that Galeano himself experienced as he was writing this. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome as well to a brand new book. We've just finished Emma Goldman's incredible Anarchism and Other Essays. You can check out this whole reading series, everything that's about to come on Open Veins, everything about Anarchism and Other Essays, a few other books, including Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Arundhati Roy's Capitalism, A Ghost Story, and Chomsky and Herman's unbelievable Manufacturing Consent. We have breakdowns for all of those books. You can check that out at the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. All of this main feed book stuff is absolutely free over there. Now, this video is an introduction to this book. It's going to tell you a little bit of the background and the history of Galeano himself, as well as a couple tips on how to read this book as you're getting into it. And if I've done this right, all of these chapters in this video should be time-coded down below, so you can skip around if you're interested in that sort of thing. Now, if you're not a sit down and watch a video kind of person, all of this will be in downloadable PDF format, along with some extra readings, extra materials, extra stuff that you can do to read around this book, because this book is a lot, but there's a lot more to it as well, kind of behind this. And as always, just a brief reminder, please check out any of my social channels, the TikTok, Instagram, the YouTube channel, like, subscribe. Let me know what you think about this book. Does this book deserve the hype? What do you think are the most important takeaways from this book? All of that stuff. I'm really enjoying kind of the discussion that's going on and on those social sites. So it's just really, really cool to see. I feel very, very lucky to be able to come and do this and talk about these fantastic books. So let me know what you think as always, and let's dive in to Open Veins of Latin America. Let's talk first of all about how to literally approach reading this book, because this can feel a little bit overwhelming. I consider this book to be extremely important to me personally. Half of my family comes from Latin America. I have been there many times. I worked there for many years. A lot of this is something that I take very seriously, a lot of this history. And I have read this particular book several times. Now, do I think that there are more complete histories of this kind of colonization? Yes, absolutely. Do I think that there are more in-depth histories of Latin America? Absolutely. But this book has an undeniable power, and with that comes a certain amount of trepidation, right? You can be a little intimidated by a work like this, but don't worry, because it's an extremely approachable work. Now, the first thing I would say is don't take this as a literal history, a kind of linear through time history. That's not what this is at all. Galeano is in here weaving different countries, different time periods, and different events together into a tapestry that tells the story of Latin America, I think possibly better than a straight history really could. So with that in mind, I have 4 recommendations here. First of all, take this in sections. This book is divided up into several sections that read kind of as independent essays, and that's exactly how you should take them. They will be talking about historical periods, so the exploitation of gold and silver, the sugar and agribusiness. There is a section on modern corporations, all of that. Take these as self-contained units that exist kind of in their own spheres and examine them on their own terms. And also, do not worry if you don't get every single reference on the first pass. There's a lot here to digest. Second thing, embrace the narrative voice here. This is not a history book like you've read probably ever before. Galeano is noted for his emotional, poetic language. There's a lot on the page here, so just sit back and kind of embrace this very rich writing style that's at times quite literary. Now, it's not actually as literary as Galeano is going to end up being. This is probably a type of writing that he would have called stodgy when he's looking back on it later in life, but this is still, very, very soaring language here. Third thing, look for modern parallels. So the world has changed a lot since this book first came out in 1971. I mean a lot. We will talk about a lot of this, a lot of how the world has shifted and how these kinds of ways of colonizing places have morphed into same system but different look. So as you read this book, consider kind of how this book may lead us into a better understanding of the modern world. And the fourth thing I would say is just look around for external sources, because a lot of this material is extremely well complemented by a lot of extra resources that I will link below, and I will link in that PDF document as well. We're talking everything from extra books. There's a book by Joseph Stiglitz on there, or the economist Ha-Joon Chang, or there are incredible movies out there that you can watch as well. Just texts around this book that build out a fuller picture of what Open Veins is trying to do. Also, bonus fifth piece of advice, which I didn't put in the PDF, but read this with a notebook. This is my notebook here. Voila. This is just probably the best way to go through this book. Every time you encounter something that seems interesting, just jot it down and take a look at it later, because it can kind of provide you a fuller picture. And it's one thing that when I was starting to write the scripts for these video lectures, I went through and properly noted out the book, and there's a lot of stuff there that you might miss on the first or second pass, but with a notebook in hand, you'll just pick up. Now let's talk about historical background. This, of course, is a work of history. So in the actual videos that accompany the different sections of this book, we will get further into that history. I'm not going to deal too much with the history that's necessary to know for Open Veins. A lot of this is going to be addressed later. I mean, this is a massive undertaking that he's trying to put all of this period of time into this one book. But it is worth mentioning a few things just for historical context. So we're going to talk about dictatorship. We're going to talk about Uruguay at the time in which Galeano was writing. And we're also going to talk about Operation Condor, or Plan Condor, which is this authoritarian collusion across Latin America that takes off after this book is written, although just a few short years after this book is written, just to give you an idea of the context that Galeano himself is living in after this book comes out. So let's start with dictatorship. Now, here's the thing. When this book first came out in 1971, most of Latin America was under active dictatorship. And that is especially true, by the way, in the southern cone, what we tend to refer to as the southern cone, which is kind of the southern half of Latin America. It includes countries like Argentina and Chile and Uruguay, obviously. So let's do a little bit of a survey of what exactly we're looking at when we look at Latin America in 1971. Now, in Argentina, which borders Uruguay and has a significant amount of economic influence over Uruguay, there was already a dictator in place. That's Brigadier General Roberto Marcelo Levingston. And Levingston himself was also overthrown that same exact year in yet another coup, this one led by Alejandro Lanús. So in Argentina at the time, we are really coup hopping around a bit. In Bolivia, this is the year, 1971, that a dictator named Hugo Banzer took power. In Brazil, you have Emilio Garrastazu Medici, the head of the military dictatorship, who had already been in power for 2 years at this point. In Paraguay, you have Alfredo Stroessner, who was one of the most evil dictators in Latin American history that you've never heard of. Then jumping further north, we talked about this guy in Manufacturing Consent, in the lectures on Manufacturing Consent, but this is Anastasio Somoza Debaile's Nicaragua at the time. He's there as well. Peru, by contrast, actually had a left-wing dictatorship. This is under General Juan Velasco Alvarado, but, this still counts. In 1971's Haiti, you had the power transition between Papa Doc, that's François Duvalier, to his son, also known as Baby Doc, that's Jean-Claude Duvalier. And both of these men, by the way, presidents for life. You also, across the region, had a few governments who were de facto military dictatorships at the time. For example, Panama was nominally civilian-controlled, but most historians tend to agree that the military at the time actually held the real power. Mexico, under the time, also a single-party democracy, so this is a democracy, but there is just one party. Same deal for Cuba, which is one communist party, and this is Fidel Castro's Cuba, of course. Colombia was democratic, but had a very restrictive power-sharing agreement between two main parties. And then you had El Salvador, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic, which were all nominally civilian-controlled, but the military in each case held the real power. Then you had Ecuador, which was a democracy transitioning to dictatorship, and Honduras, which was a dictatorship transitioning to democracy. So overall, giant survey of Latin America, right? You have very few bright spots. Mostly we are talking about authoritarian, dictatorial, military control across Latin America. Really, the only bright spots you have are Venezuela, which was a true democracy at the time. You also have Chile under Salvador Allende, which is about to fall in a couple years to another military coup under Augusto Pinochet, and Uruguay, which is a democratic nation, but in full pelt transition to dictatorship. And just 2 years after this book is published, Uruguay, I think it's fair to say, will be in full dictatorship. So that is a very rapid survey of the various authoritarian tendencies across Latin America at the time at which this book comes out. So just the context that you have to know in Latin America is extraordinary levels of military control. But now let's talk about Uruguay itself, where Eduardo Galeano is writing at the time. Now, when Galeano was writing this book, a political movement had kicked off, started back in the 1960s. And this movement sought to challenge the dominant political ruling class and was trying to bring a model of revolution that had started kind of in rural revolution. So take the peasants and use them to catapult you into full-scale rebellion that had worked really well in places like China and Cuba. And so they were, the Uruguayan revolutionaries were trying to emulate that model and bring it to an urban atmosphere, because Uruguay is very, very urbanized. It's very centralized around the main city of Montevideo, the capital. So let's talk quickly about the Tupamaros. The Tupamaros, as I said, they began in the 1960s, and Tupamaros is named after Tupac Amaru, the last emperor of the Incan Empire, which had fallen at this point. He was the Sapa Inca who kind of took up the helm and took arms against the Spanish, and of course was killed for his troubles. Now the Tupamaros, which come around in the 1960s, are much more successful for a time. So the Tupamaros were trying to cultivate what is essentially a Robin Hood-esque reputation. They were quite successful at building a support network in Montevideo and trying to bring this kind of urban guerrilla warfare, very specific, very targeted, and high-profile kidnappings and assassinations and destruction of particular property, that sort of thing. In the end, of course, the state came down extremely hard, as kind of it always does. And in this massive push, the Tupamaru members by the hundreds were arrested, tortured, and many of them killed. And this campaign against the Tupamaros, by the way, is what ends up pushing Uruguay into full military coup by 1973. However, this Tupamaro influence, it's not really crushed. I mean, the movement itself is crushed, but a lot of those early revolutionaries actually returned to political life later on. Notoriously, Pepe Mujica, who was the very, very famous and well-known and quite well-respected president of Uruguay for many years. He's still alive, by the way, still in retirement as I'm recording this in 2025, and still extremely well-respected. So this is roughly the context which Galeano is writing in. But let's talk a little bit about what happens afterwards. Well, let's talk about Operation Condor. Now, Operation Condor is a coordinated campaign of brutal repression across Latin America carried out against leftists across the region and perpetrated by Latin America's dictatorships. It officially begins in 1975, so 4 years, I'm doing quick math here, so 4 years after this book gets published. But this and the crackdown in Uruguay is what ends up driving Galeano into exile, which we'll talk about when we get to his life story in just a little bit. So Operation Condor is officially spearheaded by Chile's intelligence services under Augusto Pinochet. And Chile is supported by Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. Operation Condor had 3 distinct phases. In the first phase, data was collected on leftists and leftist organizations, as much data as possible, and collected in a centralized database so that they could be pursued. The second phase was domestic. So across Latin America, a lot of these leftists were arrested, tortured, killed, disappeared, all of this stuff across the continent. The third phase was the international operations, which was weirdly successful until it started to step on the toes of the United States. Because what you have to know about Operation Condor is that all of this is being done with near complete impunity. There is really very little backlash in the international community, in the press. A lot of this the press doesn't even know about until many, many years later. A lot of the stuff that is happening is just being done without really any care for any particular repercussion. And the United States knew about this and supported Operation Condor pretty much at every stage, until it came to those international assassinations. So there was a particularly high-profile murder of a former Chilean interior minister. This is Orlando Letelier in 1976. He gets killed in Washington, D.C. by a car bomb. And this is done by Chilean operatives. Now, because it's been done on U.S. soil, literally in Washington, D.C., and so brazenly, the United States State Department starts to push back. But nonetheless, Condor officially persists until the 1980s. Gradually, it fades as there are democratic transitions across Latin America. And in the aftermath, there are these big amnesty laws and amnesty programs that allow a lot of the perpetrators to completely avoid justice. However, there has been a push recently for more accountability. And if you want more information, by the way, the Centro de Estudios Legales y Sociales in Argentina has a great website that I have linked. And I can't recommend enough, by the way, that you check out that website. It really genuinely is awesome. So that's just a little bit of relevant historical context. Let's talk more specifically about Galeano, who he was, where he went, and how he lived. So, biography, and that means we're going to get to a classic Latin American name. Ready? Eduardo Germán María Hugues Galeano was born in Montevideo, which is the capital of Uruguay, and he's born into a middle-class Catholic family of European descent. So born into very favorable circumstances. And by the way, that long extended name that I just gave, what you should take away from that is that he's actually writing under his mother's maiden name. His pen name, Eduardo Galeano, is from his mother's maiden name. That's what he's picking. Now, he went through the school system, but only spent 2 years in secondary school before he drops out. Now, from a very early age, he starts working in and around this kind of political analysis. In fact, he starts at age 14 working as a political cartoonist for the Uruguayan Socialist Party's main paper, that's El Sol. But he doesn't properly start his career until the 1960s. In the 1960s, he starts working for various media outlets in Montevideo. He eventually joins a very influential paper called Marcha, and we'll come back to Marcha in a second. And at this point in his career, Galeano is kind of at the heart of this swirling Latin American left-wing Marxist and socialist thought. The Cuban Revolution kicks off, and he moves to Cuba for a little bit. He moves to China and writes a whole book about it. When Jacobo Arbenz is ousted in a military coup backed by the United States, which we talked about in Manufacturing Consent, when Arbenz is thrown out, he goes and travels to Guatemala and writes a book based on interviews that he does with guerrilla fighters in Guatemala. So he's off. He's all over the place. He's around the world. And it's during this period, and mostly back in Montevideo, but also, as he's doing all this other work around the sides, it's during this period that he starts writing Open Veins of Latin America, which is what's going to be considered eventually his magnum opus. Supposedly, he wrote this book in just 12 weeks, which is pretty impressive, and I think you can kind of tell. There's a broadness to this book. This book can be quite impressionistic. Galeano says he wanted to breathe new life into the history of Latin America, and I think he does that very successfully here. In Open Veins, he is assembling just a mountain of evidence that he just has at his command, and he analyzes it through this very brilliant and incisive lens. Of course, this book was immediately banned in several countries, and it's what Galeano says actually helped cement the book's status and fame. It really helped him, this early crackdown. However, all of this work was starting to get him in trouble back in Uruguay. Remember the politics at the time. After this coup happens in Uruguay, which is quite a slow-moving coup, actually, but the military does effectively take power, he's arrested and jailed for several days. He remembers hearing screams at night and scratching his name into the wall. He doesn't know how long he's going to be there, and ultimately it ends up being just a couple days, and right after that, he moves to Argentina. In Argentina, he starts another magazine. This is Crisis, but Argentina falls into yet another coup 3 years later, and so he flies to Spain. Now, during his years of exile outside of Uruguay, Galeano starts to hone this very particular style, and it's a style that comes to define him. It's not quite journalism, it's not quite history, it's not quite personal anecdote. It contains a heavy dose of the poetic. He wanted this writing to kind of reclaim the voices and experiences of everyday people in Latin America that he felt were just being lost and ignored. So all the people that have been sort of systematically erased and marginalized, this is the people that he wants to bring to life in his writing, and he's doing this through a very evocative style. And that does come through in this book, but it really comes through in Memory of Fire, which is the trilogy that he writes later and is kind of a collage of American history. It's very, very interesting. I personally, listen, this is going to get me into some trouble, but personally, I think Open Veins is actually the superior work. However, Memory of Fire is just as an opus, as like this giant thing that he's written, is a brilliant work in its own right, of course. Now, eventually, democracy is reestablished in Uruguay. That happens in 1985, and Galeano returns to his home country. He initially wants to reestablish Marcha, that's the magazine that he helped edit before his exile, but he ends up just relaunching it because the previous editor has passed away. So he renames it Brecha and starts all over again. And with that, he starts to settle in. He sort of settles back and starts to write histories and accounts of Latin America that he thinks that people have forgotten. He wants to remind Latin Americans of a history that they were taught to forget. I'm a writer obsessed with remembering, he says, with remembering the past of America above all, and above all that of Latin America, intimate land condemned to forgetfulness. By the way, this has just reminded me, one of the conventions that I'll be using in this video and a lot of other videos is referring to the Americas as America. When people normally say America, they mean the United States, but when you read a Latin American author, especially somebody like Galeano, when they say America, they are referring to America, the Americas. If I mean the United States, I will say the United States, and if I say America, as in this case, chances are I'm talking about the Americas, the continental span. That's just something, by the way, that you can be so pedantic about and really annoy your friends if you so choose. Anyway, after this point, Galeano enters a period of real freedom. He's widely celebrated, and he could kind of write what he liked. This is a period more or less without fear of political reprisals. He ends up falling into the anti-globalization movement that takes off in the 1990s. He wrote a book about Latin American soccer or football, depending on where you are. And he even became, close friends with a number of world leaders, including Pepe Mujica, who was the eventual president of Uruguay. Now, at certain points later on in life, he could be quite critical of his own work. And in 2014, he actually made headlines, including one very ridiculous story in the New York Times that talks about repudiating his work. He never really repudiated his work, but he said that it was painful to revisit his past writing style. Critics, of course, jumped on that at the time, saying it was some kind of repudiation. It absolutely was not. He's just repeating what he was kind of always saying about the stodgy leftist style that he has used as a young man and that he felt he had since left behind. That's what that was. So if you end up reading around this book and run into those headlines, I think that is a very, very unfair thing to call this a repudiation. He never repudiated any of this. Anyway, Galeano died on April 13th, 2015, back in Montevideo. His last book was written in what became his signature style of impressions and vignettes. It's called Hunter of Stories, or Cazador de Historias, and it includes this part that I just want to read to you real quick, just to give you a sense of what this book is actually like. The vignette is titled Very Brief Synthesis of Contemporary History, and it goes like this. For several centuries, subjects have donned the garb of citizens, and monarchies have preferred to call themselves republics. Local dictatorships claiming to be democracies opened their doors to the steamroller of the global market. In this kingdom of the free, we are all united as one. But are we one or are we no one? Buyers or bought? Sellers or sold? Spies or spied upon? We live imprisoned behind invisible bars, betrayed by machines that feign obedience but spread lies with cybernetic impunity. Machines rule in homes, factories, offices, farms, and mines, and also on city streets where we pedestrians are but a nuisance. Machines also rule in wars, where they do as much of the killing as warriors in uniform or more. And with that, let's get on to some major themes. Now, one of the themes I want to talk about is dependency theory. Galeano is considered a dependency theorist, which is a term you may or may not have heard before, but it's rooted in something called structuralist economics, and it's very much a Latin American idea that then takes root around the rest of the world. So this is thinkers like Raul Prebisch, who kind of kicks this off, the Argentine economist. People also like André Gunder Frank, who you can absolutely read, or Fernando Enrique Cardozo. All of these thinkers are arguing that there's no linear path from underdeveloped country to developed country. So we are kind of primed by a lot of economic thinking, actually, to think that there's a path that countries go through. They start off as very poor, and then they start accumulating more resources. They start bumping themselves up in the trade infrastructure of the world, and they become rich. They develop over time. Even the language that we use of underdeveloped, developed, kind of presumes this idea, right? That over time, poor countries will become rich. And eventually, we can just all be rich countries. What the dependency theorists are saying is that's absolute nonsense. Really, what you have are wealthy nations in what's often called the core or the metropole. Sometimes the terminology varies. But these rich countries in the core that exploit the poor nations on the periphery, or the satellite states. So the rich countries in the center, they keep these periphery countries poor by design. The system is a sustained state of underdevelopment for everything that's not already rich. How do they do that? Well, they do that by building an infrastructure that we will talk more about in later lectures, but an infrastructure of international trade and investment that keeps poor nations poor so that they can be exploited and used as places to source cheap labor or cheap natural resources, whatever that is. Dependency theory, it makes a lot of sense. It does fall out of favor a little bit. It gets replaced often by something called world systems theory, which comes around under Emanuel Wallerstein. And this world systems theory, It is essentially dependency theory, but it adds different categories. You can talk about semi-periphery states, and it also highlights some of the changing dynamics. So fluctuations over time and different shifting power imbalances. It's more complex, it's more nuanced than just the rigid dependency theory. But that's just a little bit of understanding that I think is very helpful for when you go into this book. This is very much written from a dependency theory perspective. And by the way, eventually we may do a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, the Guyanese economist, which is a brilliant book as well. But this is also a dependency theory book. So dependency theory, awesome, interesting ideas. There has been a modern update, but just keep that in mind. The other thing that we should talk about in terms of major themes is the global trade regime. In this book, you will read a lot about trade, especially trade in natural resources. And so it's worth spending just a minute or two on the global rules of trade that keeps this system of exploitation running. Now, what we have in the world right now is everything from the big hubs of trade, like the World Trade Organization, to bilateral treaties and multilateral treaties among different countries that sets the rules for the game. When you come to trade as a country, you kind of have to abide by these rules, and those rules disproportionately favor rich countries because often they're the ones writing the rules. So, for example, wealthy nations typically can use tariffs to protect native industries. They can maintain subsidies, for example, for agricultural goods that then go into foreign markets, and those foreign markets can't use the same tools. They can't use the tariffs. They can't use the subsidies because that's just how the rules of trade are written. So while rich countries are allowed to protect their native industries, poor countries are forced typically to fully open their markets. And I know that's a complex idea, but if you want more information, I cannot recommend enough the book Kicking Away the Ladder by the economist Ha-Joon Chang. Ha-Joon Chang is a brilliant, brilliant economist, and I just genuinely highly recommend that. There it is linked below. It explains the whole story, and it will also make you very, very angry. Now, the last theme that I want to briefly touch on is the connection between military might and business. You will notice a lot of this in this book. This is highlighting the violent nature of global business and how corporations enforce their goals. Everything back from the way the Spanish operated in Latin America in the early days of colonization, the so-called Age of Discovery, to the modern day American empire and the way that it exploits. This is all kind of the same thing. And there's this very tight connection between military power and corporate power. And what you will see in this book, and this is why I want you to keep this theme in mind, is this long history of militaries and businesses joining forces to carve up global markets and resources. So you have European colonization, which uses naval power to secure these trading relationships and build things like the slave trade, which we will talk about in, I think, actually the first lecture when we get to Open Veins. But from this era of naval power to modern day power, where you get these peacekeeping missions, which keep markets open typically for Western goods. Often goods from the United States. And you see why it's such a potent mix too, because the corporations are providing this capital and this profit motive, and the military is providing this muscle. And so state, military, corporate interests, they all go hand in hand with exploitation, and it is a very, very tough power to resist. And when we talk about that, there's one extra bonus theme that I should probably highlight, just along the lines of military and business. When I said just now, peacekeeping missions, that should give you a little bit of a hint as you read through this book, the degree to which the empires of the world will try to justify their actions as being good and well-intentioned and necessary. There are very few empires who don't pretend that they're good. So just as we go through this, and as you're thinking about the nexus between military, business, and the states, keep in mind as well that a lot of this gets a nice coat of varnish and looks very shiny in a press release. And that's a very quick intro to Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. I cannot wait to dig into this book. This book is fantastic. I love this book. This book has meant a lot to me. I hope that people reading this will come away from it with a sense of anger and injustice and kind of feel that rage that Galeano feels. Please let me know what you think of this. If there are any other things that you would like me to cover under the umbrella of Open Veins of Latin America, please let me know. We are going to get into the first chapter next week, and then we're breaking down this work chapter by chapter so you can actually read along as you go through. Check out the Patreon channel for more stuff like this and the notes and extra resources that go along with this. Yeah, boy, what else can I say? This is a good one. This is a good one for sure. Thank you as always for watching, and I will see you next week.